Hey everyone, welcome to today's comparison video. This is a video I've been looking forward to doing for quite some time, but I've held back because I've wanted to flesh out my thoughts over the past couple months and make sure that I'm not in the honeymoon phase, speaking from the honeymoon phase as I do this head-to-head comparison so that I can try to be a bit more objective, but just be aware I'm speaking as a lover and an owner of both the Rolex Submariner and the Omega Seamaster. Now in this head-to-head, I will take both watches and we will go through 10 different categories and score each watch out of 10 per category. So at the end of the video, we will have cumulative totals out of 100 and you guys will see which elements or areas each watch excels in. And you'll also see a final total, which watch I think scores better than the other. And I will also give you guys my thoughts as an owner of which one I think would be a better buy. If you're cross-shopping both watches and you don't want to buy both, you just want to purchase one, I'll give you my thoughts there too. So let's begin. Let's start with finish and build quality, the first category. I think if you hold each one of these watches and spend a little bit of time with each one on wrist, it becomes quickly apparent that the build quality for each is very high. These are very well constructed, very well designed, executed, and put together. So I'm gonna give each watch a high score of 9. Not a perfect score. There has been one watch in this price segment of 10,000 and below that I think is noticeably nicer, and that is the Glashütte Original CQ. I think that one was just a step above in the build quality, in the finish work, but these two watches here, the Rolex and the Omega, very high, very noticeable. And I think we're splitting hairs here when we talk about the differences. Each one has crisp finishing, good edges, good details, and it's apparent in person. Now the next category is fit and comfort. This is one where I believe the Rolex pulls ahead. It's a little bit smaller in diameter, a little bit shorter in lug-to-lug length, a little bit thinner in overall profile, and the dramatic 4.5mm taper on the bracelet makes a big deal when it comes to comfort. Now, it's not too diminutive. It doesn't disappear to the point where you forget you're wearing it. I mean, it does have great wrist presence, a great dynamic factor to it, but I believe it's the more comfortable watch and the nicer fit. The Omega is great and it's probably more visually dynamic, but this bracelet here, this 20mm bracelet does not taper, adds a lot more weight to it, and the edges are just borderline too harsh, if that makes sense. Now let's talk design and overall versatility. I believe both watches have very potent designs. They are very versatile. They look great on different strap options, but I believe the Rolex has a stronger design and has a little bit more versatility for the fact that it's a bit more conservative in its design language. And I believe there's some strength to the fact that really since this watch's inception in 1954, it really hasn't changed all that much visually. It's a great design that has just been tweaked and added to over the decades, where you guys can see clean lineage here, where the modern interpretation is very similar to that original watch from the mid-1950s, and I mark that high. I think that has some real validity to it. Now I compare that with the Seamaster, and I love the design of the Seamaster. It's much more contemporary, cleaner, sleeker, and one could argue more brutal or more cold. But I look at the history of the Seamaster, and really it began earlier than the Submariner in 1948, but it was kind of a glorified dress style piece that was waterproof, and it wasn't until the late 1950s that we really got a true dive style with a rotating bezel for the design of the Seamaster. And then it really lost its way out after the heyday of the 1960s. It became kind of a quasi-dress watch. The 80s were very bad for the Seamaster, and it wasn't until the mid-1990s that they really got the design dialed in with its own DNA, and it became strong, and it resonated with us as watch fans, and then pop culture in general with its tie-in to James Bond, the Brosnan era James Bond, where we got the helium release valve and we've got the wave pattern of the dial, the skeletonized handset. And so I think it's finally found its forte when it comes to the design language. I think it just took a lot more of a meandering path. than the Rolex Submariner did. So I'm gonna do 10 out of 10 for the Rolex and 8 out of 10 for the Omega in these categories. And that ties in with the next topic, which is brand perception and history. We've touched on the history of each one of these models. This is another one where I will score each one of these watches very high. The Rolex is seen as a status symbol of having arrived. It's kind of, you know, an indication of wealth, of luxury, of success. Love that or hate that, that really is the Rolex perception around the world. And other watch brands, they really benchmark Rolex. They look to Rolex and gauge their own success based off of how they're doing in comparison to what Rolex is doing. They might not be the first brand to do a waterproof watch or a rotating dive bezel or an adjustable clasp or a number of different options, but once they do something, every other brand takes notice. Every other brand starts moving in that direction. And when Rolex does it, they really flush it out. They do it well. So I think Rolex has a very high brand perception, image, and history, even if they're not the first. But I'm not going to give them a perfect score because they've really kind of taking a beating, especially in the past 2 or so years, because people have wanted to buy the stainless steel sport models, the really desirable models, the GMT Master 2, the Sky Dweller, the Daytona, the Hulk that I have in front of the camera right here, and they've just not been able to source them at retail at the times the consumers want to purchase the watches. Now, Rolex could remedy that. They could produce more of the desirable models and produce less of some of the precious metal models or some of the ladies' pieces. They just choose not to do that. And so I am expecting some vitriolic hate in the comments regarding Rolex as a brand from people that just do not like the supply and demand issue that is a current factor in the watch scene right now when it comes to new stainless steel sports models. So they're getting a 9 out of 10, and Omega's also getting a 9 out of 10. Great history as a brand. I mean, the Speedmaster. How can you beat this for history and being an icon with its use in NASA, going to the moon, being used in low Earth orbit, in microgravity? It doesn't get much cooler than that. But I can't give them a perfect score either. They've really taken a meandering approach across its history as they've changed ownership, as they've had dark ages, as they've gone into the coaxial kind of era, and I think they could have more cohesion across their model line. And some watch enthusiasts really dislike the fact that Omega continually pumps out special edition models to the point where they feel it's devaluing the regular edition models like the Seamaster and the Speedmaster. So that's something to be aware of. I think both brands, excellent history, excellent perception, but not perfect. Now, let's get into the tactile elements and what that means: crown action, bezel action, satisfaction of the clasp and how that operates, how that feels to use. I think the Rolex is just negligibly better in each one of these categories, especially the bezel. I've not found a nicer bezel action across any watch at any price point that I've tried. The amount of torque needed, the grip, the feel, the sound, it is so satisfying, and I think that comes across here in the video. I compare that with the Seamaster, and the Seamaster doesn't have as nice of grip with this brushed scallop design. There is a small amount of backplay in the bezel, but the contrast of the indexing is very nice. The scratch resistance is very nice. The action of the clasp and crown, very good. In fact, I would say the winding action in the crown of the Omega edges out the winding action of the crown in the Rolex. The Rolex is a bit more mechanical feeling. The Omega is almost too loose. Like, as I'm winding the single barrel in the caliber 8800 coaxial movement, it doesn't quite have enough resistance. I feel like I might have to turn this 60 times before I get a full wind. It's almost a bit too soft, and the Rolex is almost a bit too mechanical feeling. It will come down to what you enjoy more, but I would say the Omega probably has a little bit nicer crown action, but the clasp action, the bezel action easily goes to the Rolex here. So 10 out of 10 for the Rolex, 9 out of 10 for the Seamaster. Now let's talk movements. The Rolex carries the 3135 caliber, which has been in production since 1988. It has been the workhorse for the Rolex family for those decades. 31 jewels, 28,800 vibrations per hour, 48 hours of power reserve, a free sprung balance set in a full balance bridge. It's a chronometer. And then Rolex also certifies it a superlative chronometer, which happens after the COSC testing. And it really fine-tunes that accuracy to an acceptable window of -2 to +2 seconds per day. And there is a blue parachrome hairspring in here, which is anti-magnetic. And in my experience, this is my best performing movement. It doesn't matter which position the watch is in. It doesn't matter how much I wear it or how much I let it sit in the watch box. It is so constant, accurate, great amplitude, no beat error. Now, it's not the latest and greatest. The 3235 is the latest iteration of this architecture, but the 3135 I greatly respect, and I will score this accordingly with the perfect score. Now let's go to the Seamaster. This is the coaxial 8800 caliber, been in production since 2016, 35 jewels, 25,200 vibrations per hour, and a little bit longer power reserve of 55 hours. This also carries a free sprung balance set and a full balance bridge. It is COSC certified and certified by the Swiss Federal Institute of Metrology, or METAS. So it will go to accuracy deviation window of 0 to +5 seconds per day. So very similar to the superlative chronometer certification that the Rolex has. And this also has a different material for the hairspring, in this instance silicon, so very anti-magnetic, great with shocks. But my criticism with the Omega coaxial tri-level escapement calibers is they only are super dialed in when they're being worn and they're in multiple positions. Or if I set this in my winder at night, it's going to be just about spot on. But if I let this sit dial up or crown down on my desk, then you're getting some pretty big deviations, up to +8 seconds per day. It's not quite as steady as what I found the 3135 to be. So for this reason, and guys, this has been more than just my Seamaster. It's been every single coaxial caliber that I've owned or that I've borrowed. And I've also heard from viewers with similar experiences. So I'm gonna score it high, 9 out of 10, but I just can't give it the 10 out of 10 because of my personal experience. Now let's talk dial details. This is one area where I think the Seamaster excels in. It looks so good under the macro lens. I love seeing the ceramic dial with the laser engraved wave pattern, the sunray chrome execution here with the pop of blue on these massive maxi applied markers. And notice the dimensionality of the luminescence here, where the center of each one of the appliques is a little bit higher in elevation than the circumference, than the edges. So it really has a dimensional effect and looks excellent in low light. I would also say that the printing is just slightly more dimensional than what I find on the Rolex. Now the Rolex is no slouch. I love the color play here. I like the crispness of the sunray, the color changing effect. If you have a black dial version, it really looks like an abyss, like an inkwell that goes on forever. It's a very great look, but not quite as visually potent, I think, as the Seamaster and some of the other models from Omega. And I found even on my Hulk, there is just a hint or shadow of irregularity in some of the white gold applied markers. So I'm going to score the Rolex 8 out of 10 and the Omega a 9 out of 10. Now you can see these details through sapphire crystals on each one of the watches. The Seamaster has a domed sapphire crystal with excellent anti-reflective treatment. I think very potent and more enjoyable as a user than what's on the Submariner from Rolex. So I look at this, especially in natural light, and I'm amazed at the clarity of the crystal. And some lights I feel like I can just reach in and touch the wave pattern on the dial. It's very well executed, but you still get a little bit of light play when the sun hits it just right. So it looks very visually dynamic, and some will complain that the anti-reflective treatment will degrade over time and will accumulate scratches, but I would say it's going to take years for that to really become noticeable. And at that point, you do need to send the watch in for servicing, and you can get a refresh there on the crystal or a replacement crystal. So I don't necessarily think it will be an issue. So I'm going to score the crystal execution 9. And now let's talk about the Submariner. This one is a bit divisive because it carries the Cyclops that people either seem to hate or enjoy. And I'm one of those guys that enjoys the Cyclops. I like seeing the magnified date. I think it's practical. I think it's good for aging eyes or those that have less than ideal eyesight. And visually, it balances out each side of the dial. We have a large rectangular applique on the 9 o'clock position, and at the 3 o'clock position, we still get that white form in the magnification of the Cyclops, the 2.5x magnification. So I like it, and there is anti-reflective treatment on the Cyclops. It is very noticeable, but you look at the rest of the flat sapphire crystal, and you do see deliberate light play on Rolex's part. What do I mean by that? Well, I really doubt that there is no anti-reflective treatment. I've had watches that have a couple layers on the bottom and they're very difficult to film to the point where my camera even has trouble focusing in on the details of the dial. Specifically, I'm looking at Oris in this respect. I'm looking at Hamilton. I know the watches carry anti-reflective treatment, but the reflections are so crisp and clean that the camera really wants to focus in on the reflections as opposed to what's behind the crystal. And I compare that with the Rolex, and I don't get that. I get the light play, I get a little bit of haze, but the reflections are a lot more enlarged, if that makes sense. So still, there's some visual interest, but it's not distracting. So I don't know if they do a very light application of AR coating. I don't know how they get this look. I know it's deliberate, and I can tell you I do prefer the crystal execution of the Seamaster. Now let's talk Loom and Legibility. Each one of these watches looks excellent in low light, very legible for each one of the models. I like the bicolor application of the Loom on the Seamaster. I like the large maxi applied markers. I think the look is great. Some watch enthusiasts do not like the design of the handset. I have not found them to be illegible. I can look at this watch at a glance and easily gauge the time, but that is a common criticism. People would prefer kind of a sword style design here. I'm not necessarily one of those people, but I do recognize that point, and I would say the Rolex is slightly more legible, and the chromolite application of luminescent formula, it's a little bit better in the longevity department as well. So I'm going to give them 8 out of 10 for each one of the watches. I think they're both great, but the Loom, the Legibility is not at Seiko levels, if that makes sense. Now that brings us to our final category, and that is the box and the extras. Now each one of the watches carries 5 years of warranty from the factory. Each one of them has nice boxes. The Rolex is a bit disappointing though. It's basically a green plastic box with a wave pattern on the top, a microfiber interior, and a very small folding portion where you can sit your paperwork, your warranty card. And I think it's adequate, like it's okay. I mean, maybe it's a little bit disappointing, but it pales in comparison with the wood style lacquer presentation box of the Seamaster, where you get the medallion push button opening, the hidden compartment, the nice polished hardware, the pleather in areas. I think the Seamaster really gives you a better box to set your watch in. And let's be honest, when we're shopping at the luxury price point, these little details, they count. It's more than just the watch on your wrist, and it becomes more of the overall experience. And I think you get a bit more with the Omega. Although either one of these watches, they don't come with extra straps. They don't come with, you know, a fabric strap or a rubber strap like some other brands will include with purchase. But I would say the box and extras, nicer on the Omega. 9 out of 10 here, 7 out of 10 for the Rolex, and that brings us to the totals. So the Seamaster cumulative scores an 87 out of 100. That's a very high score. The Rolex scores 91 out of 100, so only 4 points of difference here. So I do think the Rolex is the nicer watch. It is the noticeably nicer watch. It's the watch that I would prefer. If I could only keep one of these two, I would keep the Submariner over the Seamaster, and that wasn't always the case. There was a time when I was heavy into the watch honeymoon that I was just loving everything about the Seamaster. And I thought, you know what, with how great this watch is, even though it's not perfect, do you even need a Submariner? Do you even need a luxury watch from another brand? Because this is done so well for the price point. I think there is validity to that, but I do think the Submariner is the nicer watch overall. And if I could only choose one, I would choose the Submariner, be it the black version, the Note 8 version, the two-tone version, the full gold version. I think the Submariner is a better model overall, but the difference is negligible. The difference is small, and it's not reflected in the price point. The Seamaster retails $4,900 on the rubber strap, and the bracelet option is $5,200. Now, if you're fortunate enough to get a Rolex Submariner at retail price, you will spend minimum $7,900 on the Note 8 version, $8,950 for the standard black Submariner with the date, $9,350 on this Hulk. And if you're going up into the precious metal options, you're going to be spending upwards of $38,000 depending on the version that you get. So is it a nicer watch? Yes, I think it is. But is that reflected in the price? No. Is the Submariner, the black date at $8,950, twice the watch of the $5,200 Seamaster? I don't think it is. And I think if you're price conscious, if you're really looking to maximize your bang for buck, if you have no intention of owning both of the watches, I would suggest going for the Seamaster. There's some great color options, strap options, and I think you would really enjoy ownership as I have. Now, if price necessarily isn't a factor and you want to get the nicer watch, even if it comes with more of a premium, and even if it's more difficult to get, I would suggest buying the Submariner. And if you can get the Hulk, definitely go with that. It's only going to skyrocket in value as Rolex updates and changes the Submariner come September 1st. And I think for those of you that value retention, or I guess you could say availability, that's definitely something to consider. Now, one final thought as we wrap up the video. If you own a Seamaster or you own a Submariner, maybe you own both, or you aspire to own either one, these are excellent watches. And really, we're splitting hairs here when it comes to saying, hey, which one is better in which instance. I love both models. I think either one are worthy additions to any watch rotation, and I feel very fortunate to have these two stone cold stunners in my own watch rotation. So thanks for taking the time to watch. I know we went long here. I've kind of rambled. I might have made some mistakes. I might have gotten tongue-tied in various parts of the video. So if you have any questions, reach out to me. If you want me to elaborate on any particular point that I didn't convey very clearly, reach out. I'm happy to have a conversation with you. Thanks for watching. You guys are awesome, and I'll see you in the next video.